So last week on the podcast, I had Jeremiah, and we talked a little bit about YouTube as a youth ministry platform. And as I kind of developed this, as I said last week, I've always made fun of people who are like, hey, I'm going to start a podcast. And I'm like, hey, I guess I'm going to start a podcast. But I was thinking a lot this week about leadership transitions. And I think a lot of things, timing-wise, have me thinking about this. One, it's just about 3 years, almost to the, it is 3 years to the week, since I announced I was leaving my previous position. I spent Monday and Tuesday at Pittsburgh Seminary working with a group of people where we're studying leadership transitions, particularly in new worshiping communities or recently chartered worshiping communities. And just being in mid-council work, working for a presbytery, like we do a lot of work with transitions. And one of the things that always comes up is like, what about the leader who's leaving? What like we call it the former pastor policy. And I spent a lot of time like actually going through this stuff with people. When a pastor announces, in our system, when a pastor announces that they're leaving, ideally I'm present or somebody from our commission on ministry that works with pastors and churches is sitting there. And part of the reason that we're there is to like walk them through their next steps so that once they get this news, hey, your pastor's leaving, that there's someone to kind of set them on the course and say, okay, here's what's going to happen next. And part of that is we go over what's called our former pastor policy. And the former pastor policy basically says, look, you can be friends with someone who you used to be their pastor, but you're no longer their pastor. And that means like you need to keep your distance from the church, you need to keep your distance from worship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the policy, just if I'm totally honest, is applied and adhered to differently by different people, even within our own system, even though we're all under the same policy. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and there's a lot of scenarios for that. So what I wanted to talk about today was kind of the 3 reasons why I think pastors who are leaving, and not necessarily going to another church, right? Because if you're a pastor and you're moving on to another church, it's very different. Like there's still boundary issues, and I'll touch on that a little bit, but by and large, like you're gonna be at the church that you've been called to. But if you're like me, where you went from serving in a church to serving in a mid-council, if you move out of a church into a chaplaincy role, if you move out of a church into any sort of role where you're not gonna be an every Sunday type pastor, there's some unique circumstances there where which like you need to kind of figure out what are you going to do? What Christian community are you going to belong to? So in my case, just to kind of give you some background, I served the same church for 10 years, actually 10 years and 2 weeks to be exact. And the house where we live, actually the house where I'm shooting this, is 6 minutes from the church I served. Our kids were involved in the school, like we really liked our house. The position I was going to, it made 0 sense to move. So we knew at the outset that we were going to be balancing former pastor rules and policies with living in the same community that we had served for 10 years. And we knew that was going to make it quite interesting. But through that process, again, as I said, it's been about 3 years since we announced, I've learned some things. And what I think the default operating mode for a pastor who's leaving, whether you started the church, whether you were there for 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years, the default mode, unless there's an exceptional case, the default mode should be that you should move out. You should leave too. And I think there's 3 reasons that you do this. Number 1, I think if you linger around, you end up having most likely a negative impact on the church that you left. You cheat the church you loved. I know in my case, like when my time was done there, it was mid-July, I've actually been told by some of the youth group kids, hey, you ghosted on us. And if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically where you just disappeared. You stopped talking, you just almost vanished. And if I'm honest, I kind of did. And I actually did it on purpose. Like the ghosting wasn't an accident. I knew that I needed, and I believed they needed, a really hard, firm, clear break between my presence with them and me not being there. So yeah, I ghosted. I stopped texting. I actually had a pretty clear rule for myself. I wouldn't Facebook comment on posts, right? So like if a parent of a kid was posting, homecoming pictures that next fall, I hit the like button, but I didn't comment. Instagram photos, same thing. Happy to hit the like button, I didn't comment. I tried to very intentionally not engage. Now, if I saw somebody at Giant Eagle or if I saw somebody, at Target, of course, I said hi, I was pleasant, I was nice, like we talked, but I didn't make an intentional effort. When I left clean. Was it easy? No. Was it messy? Yes. Would some people have a different read on how I left? I'm sure they would. But I know for me, like drawing that clear boundary between saying I'm here and now I'm not was really big. And it came very clear to me. Actually, just a few months ago, I had breakfast with a college student who felt like I had ghosted. She actually used that term, and she was talking about how she felt that that was rude, that it was harsh, that that's not how I should have left. I kind of left them hanging, and I understood and I listened. And I said to her, I said, "Look," I said, "how did that affect you when it came to relating to Steph, who was the person who was going to step into my role for the next season?" And immediately it kind of clicked with her. She's like, "Oh man!" Like we immediately turned to her, and it really helped us like learn to rely and trust and like focus on her instead of you, right? So me doing that, as frustrating as it was for some of the kids, and I'm sure some of the adults and parents too, it immediately allowed my immediate successor to step into that role without feeling as though I was lingering around, right? Yes, did I have kids occasionally text me? Yes. Did I try and maintain open lines of communication? Yes. Was I perfect? I'm sure I wasn't, right? But I was really intentional in being like, hey, I am out. And I think I should say, like, my immediate successor had been my intern in that youth role. And then my ultimate successor, my more permanent successor, turned out to be a good friend of mine, right? So, like, these were not transitions that were full of animus. There was no dislike. My successor and I will get together for lunch occasionally. We have meetings together. We work together. Like there's no like tension there, or at least there's not a lot of tension there. But I think what's key to say is that I think part of it was because I drew that firm line in the sand, right? There are kids who will still occasionally text me about stuff, that they see something that's funny, but I really have tried to avoid, as best I can, any sort of pastoral involvement in these kids' lives. And I think in so doing, and again, I'm going to preface all this, this is how I see it, and not everyone will see it the same way. But the way I see it, I think my immediate successor and now the more permanent successor have benefited from the fact that I pulled a hard, cold leave. And I don't feel like I cheated the church. I don't feel like my continuing to linger had a negative impact on them because I didn't do it. I feel like the way I left, drawing that firm line, actually worked out to be a benefit, particularly for my successors. So that's the first thing. I think if you linger around, if you say, I'm moving to a role where I'm not going to be there every Sunday, I'm just going to come to worship, right? And I've actually heard people say that. Look, it's not going to be that big of a deal. I promise I won't cause conflict. If people start talking to me about the new pastor, I'm not going to say anything. Like I'm just going to come to worship. That's not true, right? You are always going to be the former pastor. My kids have gone to the day camp at the church I served for 2 summers. This will be their 3rd. And even now, 3 years later, I am keenly aware that when I show up in the parking lot to pick up my kids, I am not just another parent. I am still a former pastor. I still preached sermons to those people. I still visited them in the hospital. I still was present for key points in their lives. I'll always be a former pastor. The relationship changes, dynamic changes, yes, but I'm never just going to be just another person when I show up there. So the idea that we are somehow neutral or that we can just be another person just does not hold true. So that's the first thing. I think it is beneficial to clear out because it doesn't have a negative impact on the church you've left. The second thing is I think when you linger, when you say to yourself, well, because I'm not moving on to a new church, I'm just going to kind of stick around here, I think you actually cheat another church out of the gifts that you have. We actually ended up doing 2 different churches after we left the church that we served on staff. One was closer, and then my wife's job changed into a program role at another church, so we changed churches again. But in each of those settings, and especially in the more recent setting, I would like to think that me bringing my gifts there has been a benefit. I hear about pastors who have retired and then start attending a different church. And I've heard from the pastor who's at that church where the new retired pastor has come and arrived, how helpful it can be. They have someone who can do sacraments if they want to take a vacation on the first Sunday of the month. They have someone who can preach. They have someone who can moderate session meetings. They have someone who even can cover hospital visits, right? Like being able to come into a new setting and use your gifts can be a huge benefit to a new faith community. So I think if you linger and you choose to stay where you are, you actually cheat another church out of the fact that they could benefit from your gifts. So I think you can cheat the church you left. I think you can cheat the church that could benefit from your presence in a new way. And I think finally, you end up cheating yourself. I know for me, like, I am really glad that I have found new places and new ways to serve by fully pulling out as much as I really could the church that I served for those years. Don't get me wrong. I love those people. Love, present tense, love those people. They are still near and dear to my heart. I still see them at Target. I still see them at the grocery store. I still run into them. I'm still very fond of them. I think of them with great affection. All those things still hold true. But I know for me, the chance to integrate into a new community, it's taught me a lot about myself. I'm in a very different role, right? I'm not one of the pastors in the church that I attend. I'm not even there every week. I'm out preaching and doing visits and doing other things that are required for my job. Like it's not the same, but I'm learning things about myself. I'm learning in my own self-awareness, settling in now as a pastor who's not a pastor of a church. Like, that's an interesting experience to be a pew sitter in a congregation where you're not the pastor. I've had new opportunities to use my gifts. As I said, my wife is on the program staff of the church that we now attend. So of course, like, I'm getting voluntold, right? Like, hey, honey, can you? Which I love. Like, please don't hear me wrong. Like, I love that kind of stuff. But I've learned a lot. Like, I'm now a high school youth group volunteer, right? Like, after so many years of being staff, I'm now on the volunteer end. And I've learned a lot about youth ministry being a volunteer. That's been a really good experience for me. And it's one that if we had tried to linger and stay at the church that we had attended or that we'd served, that wouldn't have happened, right? I couldn't have been a volunteer. Now, to be clear, I'm not just another volunteer. People eventually connect the dots and figure out, oh, you're a pastor too, right? So even then, once you're a pastor, you're always a pastor no matter where you go. But it's still different. I was never these people's pastor, right? I've preached a couple times. I volunteer a fair amount. It's given me some new opportunities to grow in my gifts. Last summer, I was a 3rd through 5th grade VBS leader, right? Believe it or not, that's a job I've never done. I was always on staff for VBS. I was always coordinating. I was always working with like the teenage leaders. Like, I've never been responsible in that setting for 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. That was a very different role, being a volunteer, being under someone else's leadership, taking direction from someone else. Those were all really good experiences for me. So, to recap, I think the default mode for pastors who are leaving a situation, whether they're retiring, whether they're moving into a different form of ministry that doesn't require them to be at a different church every Sunday morning, any of those roles, the default mode should be that the pastor leaves the community by and large in full, right? It doesn't mean you cut off contact forever. It doesn't mean you can't say hi to people, but you pull out, right? You find a new community to call your own, to worship in, to serve in, to volunteer in. And I think that should be the default mode. Now, I am sure there are cases, and in fact, if I'm honest, the church I served for 10 years had a former pastor sitting in the congregation many of those Sundays, and his wife was on the staff. And I'll be honest, by my view, it was a good arrangement. It was healthy. It worked, right? So I've seen the exception. I've lived it, and I know there are exceptions. But the default mode, the first plan, unless there's a really good reason otherwise, is I believe that the departing pastor should find a new church to call their own. I think it benefits the church that they served, even though it's difficult. I think it benefits the church that they begin attending. And I think more than anything, it can benefit the pastor herself or himself as they get to now sit in a different role in the community and learn and experience different things. So I know this was a pretty focused topic, but it's just been on my mind a whole lot about managing transition well and just the need to withdraw, to step back, especially for those who are moving into retirement or moving into a situation where they're not going to be at another church every Sunday morning. So take care.